So this seems like a good time to switch to our second speaker, Shantanu Chakrabartty. And so he's, I understand, is going to sort of go in the opposite direction here and learn from the brain and try to apply it to chips.
Sure.
So please take it away.
Yeah, so I'm not using the same title as Keith, and I think Keith gave a very nice presentation on mainly from the motivation that why reductionism may not be the only way to address the problem of understanding the brain. So I am an engineer, I'm a professor in electrical and systems engineering, so I come with a different mindset to this. And so I will start with, with one of my favorite quotation from Richard Feynman, which is that, if you cannot design or create something, then you don't fully understand. And this is applicable to the human brain too. So as Keith mentioned, that one way to understand the mechanism of the brain is the reductionist approach. You essentially use all these different imaging tools that are available to you, like MRI, electrodes. You poke different regions of the brain, you record the neural activity, and then you try to understand how the different neuronal populations are connected to each other, or from a functional point of view, how they actually talk to each other. So in my lab, we do work on instrumentation. So here is an example. So I'm not sure whether you can see the mouse. Yeah, so as I said, there are two ways in which we could understand the brain. Keith pointed out there's one way is, okay, if you click the next. Yeah, so one way is to measure the neural activity, and we build a whole bunch of different instrumentation ranging from mice, and then there's an example that is shown over here where we are recording the neural activity from bugs. So of course there is a big challenge in designing instrumentation that has to go into the tiny brain of the bug, especially if you want to keep them alive. Yes, we can't record from we don't have 600 channels as Keith has, but we can record from 5, 6, or even like 10 channels, and that sometimes is sufficient for us to infer what's going on in the bug's brain. The second approach, so Trish, if you, is actually the approach is older than this reductionist approach, and that's through emulation. And the idea there is that if you have some kind of a artificial computational substrate, and in this case, it could be a mechanical substrate, or it could be something using silicon chips, then you could, in principle, emulate different parts of the brain. And so here at the bottom, I'm showing two examples of some of these well-known, established, so-called neuromorphic systems. One is from IBM. It has about close to 100 million neurons. And then the other one is a European Union project, which is called Spinnaker. It uses computer chips to essentially emulate the whole host of functionality of the activity of the brain. Trish, if you go to the next slide. Okay, and so 20 years ago, if somebody had said that, okay, you want to emulate a part of a brain, or let's say the whole brain, people would say, hey, the technology is not there yet. And the reason being is that in biology, things are packed together in a 3-dimensional substrate. You can pack lots of neurons, a lot of synapses together. So here are some typical numbers that of number of neurons could range from maybe 1 million all the way to billions in a human brain. But that argument went away about 10 years ago. And Trish, if you go to the next slide, yeah. So these are the numbers from 10 years ago, which kind of tells you that, the current processors can actually integrate devices at the same density as what you will find in biology, neurobiology. So effectively, you can easily integrate more than 1 billion cross connects or wires in a centimeter square density. Number of transistors are definitely much larger than the number of neurons. And then, of course, you use the fact that your chips are much faster than the way in which the typical firing rate of a single neuron. So one would think that at least from a physical density point of view, silicon should actually outperform neurobiology in all aspects. And this is where there's a catch. So the progress in hardware, has not gone in vain. So if you look at the things that have been developed based on hardware, so Trish, if you go to the next slide. So if you click again, Trish. Yeah, so all these different technologies that have been developed, and right now the buzzword is deep learning. But the unsung hero in the deep learning revolution is actually hardware. So if GPUs were not developed to accelerate some of the deep learning hardware and deep learning training algorithms, I don't think deep learning would have reached the point as what it is now. So, in many cognitive tasks, pure crunching numbers, deep networks and other AI machine learning approaches can actually outperform humans and other, I would say, biological systems in domain-specific applications. But the catch lies somewhere else. And that's what my research focuses on, and some of the techniques that we are developing in the lab is kind of targeted toward that. And it's also aligns very well with what Keith pointed out. So Trish, if you go to the next slide. So the gap is what I call the neuron-to-network performance gap. And the way in which I'm going to illustrate this is I'm going to throw some numbers at you, because I'm an engineer, so I'd like to show this in terms of graph. So here I'm showing on the x-axis is what's some metric of task complexity, like how complex the system could be. Think of it like for a chess, it would be how much effort does it take to do a brute force search to find the right optimal move. On the y-axis, it is the energy efficiency metric, like how much, so if you're studying for the test, how much power or things that you're burning to be able to achieve the same task. So silicon, biological neurons and silicon neuron, if you look at the task complexity, they are kind of very similar. I mean, actually silicon neurons do outperform the energy efficiency of biological neurons, because biology, at a reductionist point of view, at a single neuron point of view, is not very optimized for energy efficiency. It's slow, it's clunky, it uses ions, it has a big membrane capacitance that it has to charge. Whereas in silicon, you can actually do a lot of optimization tricks. You can actually make the transistors more efficient. You can do a lot of these electrical tricks to be able to outperform the basic functionality of a single neuron. But on the other hand, biological neuron by itself has some, I would say, added complexity. As for folks who have actually modeled a single neuron, they know that the level of complexity that they can include is enormous. Starting from Hodgkin-Huxley, ion channel, a lot of things can be incorporated into a single neuron model. But if you now look at the trend on how some of these artificial AI processors have approached, starting from a silicon neuron, so actually it's moving by itself. So Trish, if you go back to the previous slide. Previous slide, please. Yeah. So if you look at the trend of how some of these silicon processors have evolved, even though each individual silicon neuron is highly energy efficient, it follows a curve that looks like it's not very efficient. Whereas biology somehow has figured out at a network level, if it can interconnect these neurons in a very specific way, not only it can get benefits in energy efficiency, as is shown for a human brain, but it also achieves this notion of what's called general intelligence. And that is something that is still, many of the AI systems, it's like a dream come true, that a single topology or a single substrate can perform multiple different tasks. Okay. So for example, Google, the LENet Tesla, which is for an image recognition task, it has the same energy efficiency as a human brain in principle, but it can only do the image recognition task very well. In fact, it can do better than the human brain to some degree. I mean, they have shown it for very application domain tasks. Same is true for AlphaGo 0. And now, Trish, if you go to the next slide. another caveat there is that, many of these artificial intelligence systems, they cheat a little bit, because what they do is that, they train on huge amounts of data. They collect a lot of data from the web, and then they train the system. So what the metrics that they report is mainly the performance metrics or the power metric for a fully trained system. But when you start incorporating the energy that is required to actually learn, then the power metrics go up. So Trish, if you go back, so again, it's why, I don't know why it's doing that. So yeah. So if you include the power metric for training, then there is no comparison between neurobiological system and what artificial intelligence based systems can do. Now, this is not just true for a human brain. So Trish, if you go to the next slide. For smaller systems like an insect brain consumes typically about 10 microwatt of power. That's like practically the power that you get if you stick 2 electrodes into a potato. And the insect can do remarkable tasks. It can not only do olfaction, it can sniff things out, but the way it navigates through complex environment, it actually puts some of the self-driving systems to shame. And if you look at the self-driving car, it uses this NVIDIA, the class state-of-the-art NVIDIA processor, and the energy dissipation is through the roof. So there are a lot of things that are still needed to be learned from neurobiology and how things get assembled together, like not only from a single neuron level, but how these networks evolve. And this is where something which Keith pointed out, maybe the answer might lie in criticality. Maybe the information, the way the networks are encoding information and trying to optimize for power is to operate right at the threshold of information transfer, and at the same time get benefits in terms of energy. Okay, so Trish, if you go to the next slide. Yeah, so my research, kind of focuses this mainly from an analog point of view. So even though the hypothesis is that a neuron could be considered as a digital entity which has a spike or a non-spiking behavior, we believe that there are these other dynamics that are involved, subthreshold dynamics. There are these oscillations that are useful for encoding information, and things have to be taken care of at a network level. Now, of course, complexity increases as you start combining things together, at the system level. And so there are a lot of things that needs to be learned on to make the design a little bit more formal. But the idea here is to integrate learning, Trish, if you go back, yeah, signal processing, representation, all into one combined entity as one giant system, and then address that. So what my lab does is that it actually uses transistors, silicon transistors as a baseline mechanism. And we try to solve differential equation, the same differential equation like Hodgkin-Huxley, or maybe a little bit finer way to implement some of those neural dynamics, and then combine them together in different ways to scale things up. Now, especially if you're dealing with analog, you run into a lot of problems associated with which is not an issue for a digital system. So part of the research that my group does is that how can you design a fully scalable analog system that may emulate different parts of the brain? What potentially the applications could be, other than just understanding the functionality of the brain. We can think of it like this. I'm not making any claims here, but you could use it as a replacement for some of the biological neurons as well, biological systems. So it could go into it could have a prosthetic element to this research. So with that, I'm going to stop. So Trish, if you go to the next slide. There are papers there on my lab website on how we design some of these chips. Recently, we had a paper that came out that showed how you can actually make a fully scalable analog system that emulates some of these neural dynamics, and how can you actually synthesize a large scale system. So I would refer you to that.
So I'll just start off with a question about, you said that there are these problems with analog systems that aren't there for digital systems. So I wondered if you could explain a little bit about that, and then also just give some examples of how the analog approach works better, more efficiently than the digital approach.
Yeah. So one example of where analog is not as scalable as digital is this whole notion of what's called fan-out. So, and the argument there is that if I take a system 1 and system 2 and I connect them together, in a digital system, I can individually analyze both of them separately. And so what happens is that when I connect them together, I assume that the output of the first system is not going to change based on the presence of the second system. So that again goes back to the reductionist approach. So I can reduce the system into different subsystems. In analog, as soon as you present the second system, it affects the behavior of the first system itself. So there's a coupling. And that exponentially increases as more and more elements get connected together. Now, the same principles actually has been also shown on biological neurons. So some of the new paradigms of computing, like some of the dendritic computing, glial cell computing, astrocytes, so they are all, the new domain that is coming in is all those are in the domain of analog. So they don't use spikes. They use some kind of continuous variable to actually modulate the neural responses. But from an abstraction point of view, yes, spike is nice. Describing the behavior of a neuron by its firing rate is the easy way to do, and that's what engineers have taken up, and they have kind of made a livelihood out of it.
I have a question. Hi, I'm Christine. So when you mention about scalability, can you define from your own point of view, because I have a different point of view of scalability on an entrepreneurial side. So can you define scalability, this problem in the analog?
Yeah, so scalability can take multiple forms. So one, scalability, as I mentioned in my previous response, is, if you design a subsystem, right? And I say that, okay, this system can do this task very well. And so if I scale the system by a factor of 2, I can say that, okay, I can do the task twice better. So, and so from a scalability point of view, it means that I add more, which means that I get more out of it. In analog, that's not the case because there is a coupling phenomenon. So as soon as I add the second system, it affects the first system itself. So I have to go back and rethink how the first system behaves as well. The second part is from a design point of view. So as a modeling point of view, is that if I'm a designer, when I make one subsystem, I don't want to change it, based on what maybe, let's say, Keith is going to use the subsystem for something else. I want to make a one module, and I want it to work in all different conditions. With analog, that's not the case, because depending on what environment you put it in, its behavior is going to change. So in that sense, also, it's not scalable. So you have to take into account, not only just the intrinsic variable, but also the extrinsic variables that the system is operating in.
That's very interesting. I do have another question. So would you think that with a scalable problem that you have in analog, have you ever thought about using a blockchain platform such as Hedera Hashgraph to help with the problems with the analog and then transition it to a much more nascent technology? Well,
so there are a lot of different approaches to solve this problem. I'm not saying that there is one specific way. So like the technique that we use is mainly using so-called circuits. So whatever circuits and network theory. And a lot of challenges are involved in that. So because, but then the good thing is that there, over years of circuit design, people have come up with ways, again, a reductionist way, to make the system semi-scalable. So it's still an active area of research on how do you actually make analog systems fully scalable, and nobody has a good answer to it, because there are always drawbacks of different synthesis techniques. And then I think I didn't answer the question that Rob had asked, like why analog? And I think I should articulate that. So one of the paradigms of analog design is that it tries to use the physics of the system to do computation. So for example, a single transistor, and I will give you an example here, can do exponential function, can implement logarithmic function, can implement square function. So it uses the physics of the device to do computation. Whereas if you go to digital, it's like a brute force approach. So if there is a way, because if you think about it, like biology, or in fact brain, didn't evolve to do specific computation tasks. It's essentially used what the substrate gave it to it. Like for example, this set of differential equation, this is what the propagation physics is going to look like. And the computation was an emergent phenomenon. At least that's my impression of it, that computation came out of that coupling between different physical phenomena. So, and it's because of that, it produces systems. If you can design such a system, it can produce systems that are highly energy efficient because it's using the energy and the physics of the system to do computation. Whereas the digital systems are kind of are highly synthesized. It's an abstract way of designing a system. Yeah, I was just being a little bit philosophical there, but yes.
Christine, I was just wondering about your question about how did blockchain fit in there?
Yeah, I'm just curious. There's an article that came out from Deepak Chopra about mental health and stuff. And also I'm curious about like, what's your opinion about quantum computing in neuroscience? I'm just curious about that.
So there is a lot of similarity between quantum computing and analog computing, right? So if you and the reason again is because of this notion of coupling. Now, of course, analog uses classical phenomena, which means that there is nothing called entanglement and things like that, which quantum computing uses. But when you look at the physics of it and the way in which you design systems, there are lots of similarities between the two. And that's where I think there would be some ways in which you can find connections together. Of course, there is a very active area of research in quantum computing called analog quantum computing, which essentially uses direct probabilities, and there is again a very nice analogy between those systems and what analog computers do, and in fact also similarities with the brain. So people are trying to find analogies between the two. So there are very, very nice connections, subtle relationships between the two approaches.
Oh yeah, with Rob, I'm just going back. The reason why, because Shantanu was mentioning about substrates being replicated, because there's like this philosophical, there's this consensus mechanism in the blockchain called proof of stake, where you can replicate them through various nodes. So Hedera Hashgraph has the like energy efficiency to like scale something such as like a data substrate that Shantanu presented. That's just my perspective, but thank you.
Yeah, so the key in analog is feedback. So that's, I think, that's where a lot of things can be exploited from a computational point of view.
Well, it looks like we've run a little bit over time, but I'm glad that we had a good discussion here. And again, hope people will continue their questions outside of this meeting and visit the websites of our two speakers. And so I'd like to thank the speakers once again, and also thank all of you for attending today. And I hope to see you all next month. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for inviting us.
Yes, thank you both.
Keith, we should talk at some point because I got some ideas from your presentation.
Okay, I'm around. Catch you later.
Thank you.
Thanks.